Hello. It has been a long time since we had an edition of Rappin with Reverend Laura because we mostly did it because it was COVID and it was a way to connect with people. But I had a nice conversation with my daughter that I was like, this should be a Rappin with Reverend Laura. And she agreed. So I am honored to introduce Ruth McLeod, who you've met before. Ruth is about to finish her PhD in behavioral neuroscience and has accepted a position as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, beginning this fall. And as a neuroscientist, she and I often have conversations about science and faith. And as a preacher's kid growing up in a double pastor family, um, that's something that she kind of understands at a different level. So, Ruth, let's talk about what we were talking about the other day on the phone with
Yeah,
people being able to hear it. So,
yeah. No, I think I can give a little background of like what started this conversation.
yeah.
So I am part of a fellowship program at the University of Connecticut where I'm a graduate student, which is the science of learning and art of communication. And we had what we were calling Wonder Talks, which is basically, it was pitched as The Moth Comes to Yukon. And it was people telling their stories about how they kind of got involved in science or things that brought them wonder for science. And the aim was kind of like to combat burnout. But in listening to their stories and having listened to my parents and other people's testimonials in kind of a church setting, I was really struck at how similar a lot of those journeys were. And it kind of spurred this conversation about how religion and science, even though they're often pitched as kind of opposites of each other, are really more similar than they are different, which I thought was, just an interesting idea. Um, yeah.
That's cool. So, people, the UCC has had a tradition of being not only progressive theologically, but also a faith that understands and accepts and honors science
Mm-hmm.
and values it. In fact, several years ago, they did a campaign where they were really like trying to bring more scientists into the UCC because it was like not mutually exclusive to be a scientist and a person of faith. How have you felt that like personally?
Yeah, I have always found if I'm like in a science setting and I start talking about like my family background,
Mhm.
saying that I have two minister parents, the immediate reaction is either, wow, you're a rebel, or how did you possibly get involved in science from that?
Right, right.
Um, and I think what's very funny about that is we have lots of conversations because I think we're both justice oriented people
Mhm.
about kind of the systems that we work within and how those systems affect people. And I'm like, I'm going into academia. My parents just went into academia with Jesus. Like it's the same, we're in the same system.
We're in the academy. Yes.
Yes, we are both in our like ivory towers doing our studies.
Yes.
Um, one is about the like history of religion, one is about the like molecules of the brain. It's just, I think it's really interesting. And I think in particular, the UCC was really helpful for me as a scientist and a scientist in keeping my faith as I journeyed further into science, because the UCC was always a church that encouraged questioning,
Yeah.
which is something that science is supposed to do.
Mhm.
And so for me, those things are not at all separate. The goal of religion and the goal of science is the same, which is to understand why we're here, to be better people, and to learn a little bit while we journey. Um, and I think it's interesting, but I also understand that people that don't come from a UCC background, that would be like, how did you go into a field where like the goal is questioning everything if you are in a religion that
Right.
discourages questions.
Right. Right.
Um, but I can also say one of the things we also in our original phone conversation we
Yeah.
had about this um, was we talked about how um, science and religion. Hello, this is my cat Poe.
My grandbaby's here. Hi, Poe.
Say hello. Um, but we had talked about how in a lot of ways religion has been used to justify injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And especially right now in our political climate, religion is being used to justify a heck ton of a lot of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean the UCC is included in that, right? But people kind of use religion as a battering ram
Right. Right.
sometimes. And what I think is interesting is in the history of science, science has been used the same way
Yeah.
to push incorrect ideas. There were studies that showed that tried to argue that Black people were a different, lesser species
Right.
than white
Right.
people, and that was validated science at the time.
Right.
Um, and so, in the same way that religion can be used to uphold inequalities and to further agendas, science can do the same thing.
Right. Right.
Um, you know, and they're used in those ways at different times. It depends on when you talk about them, right?
Right.
Uh, yeah, it's really
So, yeah, one of the things that I'm doing in the racial justice work and the LGBTQ justice work is like trying to unpack the um, colonized
hmm
colonizing history of the church, even though my church that I serve may not espouse those things overtly. We That is the foundation of Christianity in America. And
oh yeah.
so, having to unpack that and um, kind of uh I think like atone for it, and make reparations in some way, not just necessarily all financial, but like admit and
hmm
face like that history.
Have some
And
accountability.
yeah, exactly. So how do you experience that in the academy and academia?
Yeah, I I think the first thing to acknowledge is that it's present in the academy.
Right.
The science as a whole, again, like when you look at like the lofty goals of science, like science sounds awesome, right?
Hmm.
Um, that is not what the reality of science practices are,
Hmm.
nor the reality of the institutions that support science. Um, Science is trying to get better in the same way that I think the church and the UCC is focused on accountability
Hmm.
and improving their justice oriented work. Um,
Hmm.
Science is trying to do the same thing. But I think because we live in the particular time that we do, where there is a lot of rhetoric about discounting
Hmm.
scientific evidence, in fact, I think sometimes people are afraid to also hold science accountable.
Oh.
Um, and because of that, I have run into people that are sometimes unwilling to discuss the unjust history of science, right? Um,
Mm.
I think weirdly enough, I'm in a really good field for being justice oriented. I'm in psychology, which is all about the study of humans.
Right.
And psychology in particular has been really, really guilty of a lot of the crimes that we're talking about.
Right.
Crimes of injustice, crimes of exclusion, um, crimes of shutting down voices.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think in psychology, there's a lot of accountability about it. Um, I work on as part of different mentoring networks that are focused on bringing in people whose voices have not been heard in the
Hmm.
academy in. Because one of the principles of science is anyone can do it. And in fact, the more diverse the people doing it, the better the science becomes.
Right. Right.
Um, but it's important to acknowledge, just as with the church, it was an old white man game for a long time.
Right. Right. And you've
Um,
been telling me that in that DEI work, you're finding it really hard to bring um people who have not been included in that into the academy because of the way it's set up to favor, you know, straight white
yeah,
men. You
yeah.
know?
Well,
Yeah.
and it's fascinating that we can be part of such a system that kind of oozes this feeling of progress.
Yeah.
And yet it is, because it is a system that exists within the overall system of the United States and the overall system of the world, it
Hmm.
is also subject to all of its faults.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I think that's a hard thing. And I want to be clear that this bias doesn't just exist in psychology.
Right.
I think psychology sometimes gets a bad rap about it because we've been the field that kind of got hit the hardest by
Right.
some of the mistakes we've made,
Right.
and like straight up crimes that have just been committed in the name of
Right. Right.
knowledge.
Right.
Like, do we want to talk about Tuskegee? But
Right.
I
Right.
mean, like, just straight up crimes.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but those kind of actions are present in biology, in chemistry, and in
Right.
engineering, in physics, in fields that we tend to think of as more objective. All of these things are still present there as well.
Yeah.
Um, and it's yeah, it can be a challenge to bring people in. And I think we also live in a time where scientific information is told like you have to believe science, but no one
Mhm.
tells you how to read science or understand science, or that, like, hey, the science is government funded, so technically your taxes paid for it, so you should probably have some access to those publications.
Right. Right.
um and that's all. These are all symptoms of the unjust system around science together.
Right.
And because of that, that system leads to people who are already disenfranchised becoming more so.
Right.
Because, however subtly, and sometimes it's very explicit,
Right.
they're told, well, this isn't for you.
Mhm. Right.
This oh, you want to go into physics? Well, it's probably not for you, because we're not going to talk about any of the physicists of color that did really cool things, or
Mhm.
the, like, women who did really cool things, or the queer people who did really cool things.
Mhm.
Or we're going to present these ideas as so complex, and so gate kept, and as if
Right.
I, the instructor, am the keeper of all knowledge rather than you, the students, that it's really more about your curiosity than my knowledge. Um, it leads to a system where you don't feel like you own what you're learning.
Right.
And when
Right.
that happens, you don't want to pursue it because you feel like it's not yours. Like
Right.
you're the outsider in that setting. Um, in a similar way that the church does the same thing by saying, like, well, this isn't for you, and we're okay with these people but not those people. And
Right.
you
Yeah, and
know
I would say the church, most churches, I mean, most progressive churches like ours, like the
Mhm.
UCC, um, it's not overt, it's covert. So
Oh, absolutely.
that welcome comes with, like, it's like, of course, everybody's welcome here.
Mhm.
But, what are the barriers to that welcome? And I'm sure you encounter that in academia too. It's like, like there's no access. This is, many African descended people don't live out where the church is. There's no
Mhm.
bus line. There's no, you get pulled over for driving while black in this community all the time. So we can be as welcoming as we want to be. But until and that's the justice issue, we attack the barriers. Just like you could say anybody can come into the neuroscience department at
Mhm.
UConn, but you have a lot of
But
people who are. who are first
But
generation college students, who don't have the funding, who
mhm.
don't know how to navigate the system, you know?
No, and we live in a system where, yeah, anyone can come into the neuroscience department, but you better be ready to work with all but two white male faculty members.
Right. Right.
And, and especially when it comes to grad school,
Mm,
there is such a level of like, when you're applying to grad school, you don't just get to be a name on a sheet of paper.
right,
You have to go for an interview. You have to be interviewed over Zoom sometimes. You have to go meet the people. And if there is someone in the department that has a lot of unconscious bias and is going to be judging you based on things that they know about you from your CV or your resume or your personal statement or just how you look,
right,
those things are going to come up.
right,
Um,
right.
and those are gonna prevent you from being accepted into that program.
Mm, mm,
Not just, you know, emotionally and mentally, like, accepted as part of the community, but also, like, in the door, like,
right,
getting
right,
a job.
right,
Um,
right.
and, one of I work with a mentoring network where part of our goal is, opening that door a little bit more. So it's for underrepresented students that are interested in science and going into a science field. We're particularly focused on psychology, but it covers everything. And kind of working to demystify the process.
Yeah.
Because, I have you and dad are both have advanced degrees and
Mhm.
went to school forever. And I still didn't know how the science process worked for getting
Right,
into school.
right.
Um, because it's just such a mysterious thing.
Well, isn't that part of the ivory tower, though?
Oh, yeah.
Of
It's
academia
it's
is
an
like, no,
elitism
it's
thing.
hard to
Yeah.
get there, only few can access, and, like,
Mhm.
you have to, like, answer these questions 3, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, not only do you have to answer riddles, but you also gotta know where the riddle guy's at, and you have to
Right,
email him beforehand. If you just
right,
apply to the
right,
riddle guy, he
and
won't
then he'll
accept
pass it
you.
on to the troll under the bridge, and
Yeah, yeah, and if the riddle guy can't take you, you are gonna have to fight the wolves in the forest,
right,
but they come off harsh, but they're
right,
really nice.
right,
Yeah, it's a
right.
lot. It's a lot of
It
stuff.
is, yeah,
And if you are coming from a background where you already feel kind of on the edge of that community,
right, right.
and you already are a little apprehensive about not knowing what to do,
Mhm.
to then face all of that mystery can
Yeah,
be so overwhelming that either you end up not applying at all
right,
because it's too complicated, um, or you end up applying but not having the tools you need to actually get in
yeah,
because
right,
so much of this is hidden.
right.
Um,
Well,
and I
and then there is when you face all that, bias, unconscious or implicit or explicit,
Mhm.
you know, and you are the exception in the program, then you don't have any place to process that or to go with that or to feel like,
No.
in that attitude of like, you're lucky to be here, so you better not question the system.
Well,
Um,
and the tokenization of
yes.
grad students is bad. I mean,
Mm.
I don't know if you've been following, like, people will write articles about, people releasing their college brochures and be like, "Wow, that small liberal arts college really got together the 3 Black students and made sure they
Right,
were in every photo."
right, right, right,
All that to say,
right.
science is also not free of these problems.
No, no. So my
Um
follow-up question is, I have 2 questions I wanna be sure we get to while we're talking.
Mhm,
One is, so in religion, and I'm saying religion,
mhm,
um, we use, like, the Bible to proof text.
mhm.
So we sometimes when that's happening in faith traditions that are different than ours is, I'm like, are we reading the same Bible?
Yeah.
But proof texting is just taking what supports my point of view and
Mhm.
taking that out of context and then just saying that as well, this says this
Mhm.
and the Bible says this. And I know that it's so hard to be literate about science if you're not a science background person. So does that happen in science? And how do we sort out what is accurate?
Mhm. Yeah, so absolutely. Cherry picking happens all the time. Uh Religion, specifically Christianity, kind of has the Bible that
Hmm.
is their, like, I'm going to smack this book in your face.
Right,
But in the same way that religions that are a little bit more text based rather than interpretation based will go like, well, it's in the Bible, just read the Bible, and not actually explain to you how to interact with the text.
right.
Science does the same thing. So
Okay,
we will say it's in the data, just read the data. But we're
right,
not going to tell you how to read the data or the fact that results can be interpreted
right,
thousands of different ways depending on how you look at them.
right,
Um, and that is a huge problem of uh, what we call like science literacy,
right.
um, which is basically this idea of being able to read and understand science writing.
Okay.
And science literacy has always been an issue, but especially became an issue during COVID, and has been an issue for like climate change
Hmm.
for a long time because people tend to cherry pick results and
Right.
throw them at things, and not actually have the context of either the paper around
Mhm.
that result, or the best one I can think of that comes up a lot is the idea that vaccines cause autism.
Right, right,
There has never been any scientific evidence to support that statement. I
right,
can say that equivocally. We've looked into it a lot.
right.
Um, but there was one paper that was published in a medical journal that made a link between vaccines and autism. This paper had to be redacted, which means it was removed.
Was
And now, if you
withdrawn.
try and look up that paper,
Yeah,
it has redacted, like
right.
written on the front of it. That scientist has been discredited. Not
Mhm.
only was it a bad interpretation of the results, the study was poorly conducted. Um,
Mm,
and if you actually read the paper, and you read the context of that story and how that paper got published, it's easy to tell that it's just junk science.
right,
They did a bad job. They were looking for a result rather than actually experimenting.
right.
Um, the scientist who published it was also trying to patent a different vaccine. Um,
Ah,
so it was also a money grab.
yeah,
There were a lot of things that happened. Um, but it also, people will still cite that paper
yeah.
as a reason to not vaccinate their children.
Wow.
Um, and that's where science literacy comes in.
Right. Being able
Where,
to understand.
yeah. And to understand that sometimes science says some things you don't like.
Mm, mm,
Science says some things I don't like.
right, right,
There are some scientific papers that I look at those results and I'm like, I don't want that to be true.
right.
Um, but part of what science should be is curious.
Mm,
And science is should be interested in getting at the objective truth
right.
rather than an ideal. Um, and science sometimes does some things
Yeah,
that kind of block out that goal a little bit.
yeah.
In the same way that I think, um, you know, we tend to use science kind of like a battering ram to be like,
Right,
believe science, understand science, do science. And I think sometimes science gets used, ironically enough, in a similar way to like pulling religious quotes,
right, right,
right?
right,
Um, in that, like, you pull a religious quote, someone else is going to pull a study, but if you don't know how to read the science and understand it,
right,
uh, you're not actually going to know what that means.
right.
I will say I am biased to a side for sure.
Right, right,
I
right,
tend to be more on the side of people who are at least trying to understand the science.
right.
Um,
Because you're
but
a
that
scientist.
yeah, and also that's a it's that idea is also further wrapped up in injustice.
Right.
Um, so if you don't have people that are educated to read and understand scientific writing,
Mhm.
those people will never be able to read the science that is what is the basis of their policies and laws, the science that justifies inequity sometimes.
Right,
And they're going to be the type of people that then go, well, if it's published, if the science is published somewhere, then it must be good,
right, right.
which is something that happens a lot. That's not true.
Yeah.
In fact, just recently, there's a thing for publications where basically they get like a rating that
Mm,
tells you how like good of a quality a
mhm,
journal is.
mhm.
The company that does those ratings removed them from several journals for being predatory in their practices.
Mm,
Because the journals would basically go, if you pay us a bunch of money, we'll publish whatever you send us.
right. Well, and it's not necessarily peer reviewed or
And it's technically peer reviewed,
right.
but likely it gets kind of pushed through the system a little bit because
Uh-huh.
they're paying the fees.
Right. It's like
Um,
self-publishing kind of.
it
Yeah,
is.
almost. Yeah. Wow.
And that means that there's a lot of poor quality science that goes through.
Right. Yeah.
Um, which is like the whole point of the publication system in scientific writing is to avoid that.
Right.
Um, and that's not to say it's a perfect system. It's not,
Right.
which is why science literacy is so important. If it was a perfect system, we could just say, trust the science that is
Right.
published.
Right.
Um, but the truth is you can't do that. Um, and the really hard thing is that we live in a world where we're so inundated with
Information.
content and
Right.
media and information um that we can't actually sort through. We don't have time to sort through everything that's
Right.
bombarded at us.
Right.
Which brings us to a bigger point of media literacy, which is
Right.
also important in religion as well.
Right. Right. Well, and the question I want to ask now is like, as somebody who grew up in the faith
Hmm.
and would consider yourself a spiritual person,
Hmm.
um, are there times when your faith comes into conflict with the science? Or do you see them overlapping?
Um, I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm going to give you a anecdotal fact that I heard once.
Okay, well, at least you're
So,
admitting. You
yeah,
heard
so
it
this
once.
is not. I don't know if this is validated.
Mhm.
But I think I learned about it in like an aging class. So it was like the biology of aging. So
Okay.
as you get older. And one of the facts that was kind of given to us is what field of science actually has the most atheists in it. And most people would say like, oh, math or
Right,
physics or
right,
quantum mechanics, something like real hard sciencey.
right.
It ends up the field with the most atheists in it is psychology and sociology.
Why is that?
The idea is that psychology and sociology, you can see the purpose that a religion would serve.
Ah,
And because you can understand that they're serving a role in society
yeah.
rather than a like, I have to believe in this thing because I'm going to go to
Right,
hell,
right,
you're less inclined to believe in it.
right.
Now, as someone in psychology, in that field,
Mhm.
that anecdotally, maybe fully incorrect, has the most
Right,
atheism
right,
in it, I am still a very spiritual person.
right.
And the people I work with are still very spiritual people.
Mm,
And I don't think that there is a conflict.
mhm.
And I think a lot of that gets put on science.
Right,
And I think it's fair to, like, if people don't believe in God because they study physics, absolutely, you do your thing. But
right.
for me, studying science made me believe further
Right.
that there's something else out there.
Right.
And I think part of that is when you're in science, I think, and when you're in religion, especially the way the UCC does religion,
Right.
you have to get comfortable with not knowing.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
And and you have to accept that you're never going to have all the answers,
Mhm.
and that your job while you're here is to just unravel as much as you can.
Mm.
You're never going to know everything. You're never going to have a moment where you understand the world's mysteries are revealed to you. You know
Right.
everything as you know
Right.
the meaning of life. Um, it's about finding that
Right.
and getting uncomfortable with the uncertainty. And then, even though you're not quite sure, still trying to be a good person.
I love that.
Um,
I
and
love that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
I think science does the same thing. Um, it's about not knowing.
Yeah.
That's what a lot of science is, and I think sometimes that gets blocked. You see it with certain scientists that are well established. Sometimes
Mhm.
they get so into their own field that
Right.
they know everything, and when someone presents a contrary idea, they can't accept it.
Right.
I think that also happens in some religious groups.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, and I think for me, I think I've talked about this with you a lot.
Mm.
Um, but I remember taking a organic chemistry class in high school and learning about hydrogen bonds, which are the bonds that form between water molecules.
Yep.
Basically, um, in the way the atoms work in a water molecule is that the electrodes are kind of pulled towards one side of it.
Mhm.
And because of that, there's a mismatch between how charged the oxygen is and how charged the hydrogen is. And so the water molecules kind of stick together because of that, because
Ah.
negative attracts positive, and so they kind of stick. They
Mhm.
don't bond, but they kind of stick. They like
Okay.
to be near each other in a particular pattern. That's what forms surface tension,
Oh, yeah.
like in a drop of water. That's also what allows things like osmosis and diffusion to occur.
Mm.
Those are all processes that no life on Earth would exist without.
Wow.
Mhm. And the fact that it is all dependent on the way that a couple tiny electrodes, which are small parts of atoms
Yeah.
that make up a single molecule, move around.
Right.
That is the key to there is life on Earth or there isn't.
Mm. So for you, it makes it feel like it's not random chance, that there is like an intentionality to creation.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that there's intentionality, but also, I don't know, because I'm someone who I am more agnostic in my leaning.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right.
um, it for me, it kind of gives me something like, if nothing else, we are so lucky.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Even if it was random chance, something's got to be pulling for us because
Right. Right.
we have been incredibly lucky to make it this
Yeah.
far.
And that's kind of back
Um,
to your like it when we started the conversation about wonder.
mhm,
Yeah. And I think
yeah,
both faith and science are based on that.
mhm,
That curiosity and sort of mysticism
mhm.
about what you're experiencing.
When I originally, this conversation, it was me talking about how I was like, I think I'm maybe gonna write like an essay about my
Right, right,
experience.
right, right.
But like, I think the first starting sentence that I gave you was, I grew up with two pastors for parents, so I am well familiar with awe.
Oh, yeah.
And the idea that, for me, finding out those discoveries about the world is
Mm,
awe-inspiring.
mm.
In the same way that, watching people hold their little candles on Christmas Eve is awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, like those are moments that are miraculous and miracles. And I'm someone who, like, you can debate all day if Jesus really walked on water,
Right.
right?
Right.
You can
Right.
try and just debunk that as much as you
Surface
can.
tension, Ruth. You just told me about
Surface
surface tension.
tension. Yeah. You can try and do that as much as you want. You can talk about raising the dead and how those are miracles. And kind of my point is, I think a lot of people who aren't in a spiritual place will say, like, well, that could never happen.
Right.
Those miracles don't occur. And my argument is, even if they didn't, even if those things didn't happen, even if it is just a story,
Right.
there are so many other miracles
Right.
happening at microscopic levels, at huge levels
Yeah.
every day. Like, the world is a wonderful, mysterious, awe-inspiring place. No matter what you tell yourself about what inspires that awe,
Right. Right.
right?
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And I think and this is something I think about too. And I think it happens when we get wrapped up in kind of our work and our burnout and everything.
Yeah.
We forget how wondrous
Yeah.
and wonderful
Yeah.
the world is. And for me, it's those moments thinking about hydrogen bonds and how
Right.
microglia work in your brain. It's real small and tiny.
Right.
But I think for religion, right, we talk about how doing a good deed is Jesus acting through you.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's also a wondrous thing.
Yeah.
Taking care of each other. We were monkeys.
Right.
And now we're like, we've created science that, like,
I'm-
has saved my life, has saved
right.
your life,
Right.
you know?
Right.
And we did that because we're humans that care about other humans.
Love that.
And that's beautiful.
It is. It's totally beautiful
And a religious experience, whether you look at it from
from that angle or not. Yeah.
it's God acting through each other to it's a scientific wonder. Um,
Hmm.
those things are wonderful and amazing.
I love that. I'm so glad you're open to that. You know, that we didn't turn you off too badly. So I
No.
have one last question, then we'll wrap it up.
Yes, please.
So give me one example of that wonder. It's specific about your work as a
Mhm.
neuroscientist.
Yeah, so something I think about a lot. So I study like premature infants is
Mhm.
basically what I study. I study babies, they're born too early. I study a specific brain injury that can occur in these babies. Um, and one of the things that I am continually struck with every time I talk to a neonatologist or look at my own data
Mm.
is the resiliency
Mm.
of these infants.
Yeah.
These infants can have kind of horrific starts to their lives.
Hmm.
They're born too early. There's an infection. They have sepsis. Now they have a brain bleed, you know. And as long as they can survive those things, yeah, might there be some complications? Absolutely. But considering everything they went through, they're gonna be pretty okay.
That's amazing.
And that resiliency of um human biology is
Mm.
really fascinating to me.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Yay. I'm going to think about that while I'm focusing on resilience on my sabbatical. So,
Yeah. Be as
oh,
resilient as the premature infant.
I shall be as resilient as the premature infant.
It's
So,
all that plasticity, man.
my brain is long hardened. So,
I can still you're forming new synapses. You're not done yet.
thank you so much for this. I mean,
No,
we could
thank
talk for
you.
hours, but I want people to actually watch it. So,
Yeah, no, yeah. That's
uh,
always good.
thanks so
Feel
much,
free to
Ruth.
cut anything you need to.
No, no, no. I love it as is. So, thanks so much, Ruth. I really appreciate you doing this. I love you.
I love you too. Thank you for talking with me.